I'm joined now by someone who started off on shows such as Crackerjack, Comedy Playhouse, Doctor Who, but was also there at the very start of things such as May to December, Yes Prime Minister, to mention a few. I think it's clear that she's worked across a whole range of shows, which is perhaps the joys of the BBC at the time. So I'd like to introduce production designer Valerie Warrender. How are you?
I'm fine, Alex, thanks. How are you?
Not bad, thank you. And managing to keep yourself busy during these rather odd times?
Yes, I think so, doing a bit of drawing and things, yes.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that the production side of things, the artist in you is still very busy these days.
Yes.
But I wanted to perhaps take you back to what I imagine must have been a fairly early time at BBC when you first encountered Doctor Who. Would it have been an early job?
Well, I suppose it was fairly early. The first one I did was in the late 70s. Though I did join the BBC initially in 65. That was in Bristol, which I worked for 3 years, and then I moved to London, where subsequently I became a designer. So yes, it was fairly early on, I suppose.
So that process from sort of having started off in Bristol to being a designer in London, were you given particular sort of training and shadowing, or was it very much learning on the job from all sorts of people?
Well, I suppose you do learn on the job, because in those days they didn't have a specific course for production design as they do now. With Bristol, which did quite a few children's programs, I was an assistant designer when I went in, and worked for a designer and helping them and drafting the sets and things. And I was still an assistant when I had a transfer to London. And in London I did what they called acting design, where you had a chance to do designing on some smaller programs to see if they thought you were capable. And from there you would go to a board and show your work and talk about it. And if there was a design position, you would be given that position.
And how different was it working in Bristol to London? Because of course at the time, Television Centre was quite a television factory at the time.
Oh, Bristol was very quiet. There was a senior designer, 2 designers and 2 assistants. The nice thing about it was that you did sort of find out about other elements like editing and things like that, because it was such a small family type concern then. And I mean, I did everything from helping in costume to changing captions on outside broadcasts, as well as being designing. So that was quite nice.
Oh wow! So it must have been quite nice then to be able to just specialise in design when you got to Television Centre.
Yes. But it did, make you appreciate the roles that other people had. But yes, it was a very different proposition, obviously, a great factory.
So you mentioned your first Doctor Who was alongside Tom Baker, called The Androids of Tara, which is a wonderful sort of science fiction historical piece. When you handed a script like that, would you approach it more as historical than science fiction?
Well, I suppose because chatting with the director, Michael Hayes, and we were talking about what locations we would use, and he had obviously specific views about, the castle. So I think we did go from that, really. And, the sort of science fiction-y bit was sort of weaving through second, really, in a way.
So once you've got, because for that story, a key location was Leeds Castle. Once you've got somewhere like that, does sort of any studio set feed off that and what elements you incorporate from the location?
Yes. Obviously one wants to have a sort of the same sort of flavour as that. And having the opportunity to film there, or had the opportunity to look around, so you could get inspiration from there. Yes.
And you mentioned that as pre-production, you're talking to the director, Michael Hayes. How was he to work with then? Because that wasn't his only Doctor
Who. He was excellent. Yes, very interesting. Actually, he had a nice vision of things, I thought myself.
As a designer, is it quite helpful when a director has a clear idea, or is it perhaps more freer if you are coming to production and you're sort of giving them the ideas?
Well, I think it works both ways, really. I think if you, depending on the production as well, I mean, sometimes you feel that you want to sort of give a lot more, maybe, if somebody's not quite clear. But I think generally most directors have some sort of idea of how they want to sort of channel the script at first.
And I imagine you would have also spoken to the costume designer, Dorian James, makeup designer, so it becomes a sort of one cohesive piece, or do they sort of follow yours and Michael's lead as the production designer?
Well, I think they follow Michael's lead. He tended to sort of chat to them about the sort of thing he was after, and then obviously we would have meetings together about the look of it.
Perhaps one of the joys of that story is that there's an awful lot within one location. As a designer, is that something of a gift, that it's not just the castle, you've got the grounds and everything around it? Because I imagine sometimes part of your job is to try and make various locations fit together as one.
Yes, I mean, as you say, that was really quite a gift, that you got such an expanse of things to use there. And obviously, a castle, gives you lots of ideas for the interiors. Yes, that was good. I mean, I quite like it when there are disparate elements that you have to fit together, actually, because it's more of a challenge, which is nice. But that was interesting. The thing is, though, with that, because of the time schedules on these things, you're often designing the sets before you even find the locations. And in fact, that was happening there. I was, mapping out the studio before we even decided on Leeds Castle. So it's a bit of jiggery-pokery, really. The funny thing about that, I thought, at the time, was that when we were filming, it was still open to the public. So obviously they had a bonus for their visits there. And I mean, Tom was absolutely marvellous with, people who were asking him questions. But I was quite taken aback at that, really.
So this would have been a time when you would have actually been on location for the filming then? You weren't sort of office-based?
Oh no, I was there because things had to be built there as well. I mean, underneath there's a scene where Tom goes round the moat in the boat with K9 to get into the castle. And in fact, we had to construct a door and an opening because there wasn't anything suitable, things like that. And there was quite a lot of sort of other dressing as well, which had to be done. So I was there the whole time, really.
From a story that is almost sort of half studio, half location, your next encounter with Doctor Who was entirely studio. So I imagine, from your point of view, that was a busier production.
Yes, in a different sort of way. I mean, it was interesting because we filmed it at Ealing Film Studios. So we could do the jungle, obviously in one part of the studio, and then with the mine shaft, because they had the tank there, we used the tank and built down into that for the mine so that Tom could sort of climb up and go over the top. But yes, it was quite hectic, really.
And something that hadn't been in Android Tara was model shots. And as a designer, how much do you have to do with a model shot? Do the VFX department look at your set and work on it themselves, or are you across that as much as the sets?
Well, actually, yes, I didn't use them on Doctor Who. On something else I have done in a light entertainment thing, actually, but and have. In fact, I think I made the model myself anyway. But it's varied because sometimes it's been done by visual effects. It depends on the individual program, really. We did have a glass shut on Androids of Tara to make the castle look slightly different at the top. So had to sort of work that out with the artist.
And something like that, would that have sort of come from Michael and the camera team, or would you have sort of gone, I want to rebuild the castle, but of course,
yes, no, I wanted to sort of make it look different, really.
And by the time you came back to Doctor Who, Mary Tam had left, Lalla Ward had come on board. Did it feel like the same show? Obviously, different directors, so there'd been different atmosphere on set, I imagine.
Yes, I think so. Yes. I don't know. I think I was always so busy. I didn't have the time to think of that element, I'm afraid.
Because having spoken to a lot of people from various departments that worked on Doctor Who at the time, it seems to have been a show that was perhaps sometimes overly ambitious for its budget. As a designer, was it a particularly challenging show?
Yes. As she said, yes, I don't think budgets were very, very large, really.
But then is that perhaps quite a good, ongoing training ground? Because I suppose if you can produce something that, Doctor Who's asking for so many different worlds and locations on a shoestring of a budget, that must prepare you well for what else can be thrown at you.
Yes, that's true. It does make you sort of use ideas, to see what you can do in the in those circumstances. You're quite right. Yes, I think it's a bit different today. Looking at the Doctor Who, I think the budgets have increased, possibly.
Yes, because something that story, I suppose, was well known for was the creature in the cave system.
Yes, I didn't. I know. It was a bit of a shock because when we saw it, I must say, we all tried to be very straight-faced. But I know Lala didn't want to stand by it, which is quite understandable.
So something like that is almost the villain of the piece, the alien. As a designer, you've designed the set, and I suppose the VFX department sort of look at where you're going with it and work on it separately then.
Yes, they do. I mean, I don't know whether that's still the case, but I mean, certainly in other productions, I don't think that would happen. I think that was one of the things about the BBC. It did tend to be a bit departmentalised, which when I was freelance, I found was very different. You had more sort of interaction, really.
Oh, of course, yeah. That's the BBC is a very particular way of working, and even the idea of being BBC staff and allocated to jobs.
Yeah.
And was it a case that once you'd done one Doctor Who successfully, it was more than likely that you'd come back, or is that perhaps just a fluke of the scheduling that you worked across 3 stories?
Yes, I think it was a fluke of the scheduling, really. I mean, if you worked with the director who particularly wanted you, if he was doing another one, I mean, directors would ask for you, and the schedulers would try and, satisfy that director. But often it was, as you say, down to the schedule.
Because am I right in thinking for Twin Dilemma, you weren't originally down to design that one?
No, it was rather sad, really, because the designer who originally started it, I'm afraid he actually did commit suicide, which was awfully sad. It's one of those things, really. And I mean, I came into it very late in the day. And wasn't very happy about that, really, because obviously the run-up time was, virtually nil.
So in that instance, would you have just inherited their work, or would you have had time to start again, or perhaps reinvent what had already been agreed?
No, I had to start, from the beginning. But yes, it wasn't one of my happier productions, I'll be quite frank.
Because I think, particularly in terms of your Doctor Who work, that's a story that must have been particularly challenging because there's a lot of sets that are there very briefly. There's spaceships, there's explosions in a quarry, there's all the various sort of catacombs. Each episode is almost totally different from a visual point of view, which must have been a challenge.
Yes, I don't quite know why they seem to pack it so much in. Yes. You could have just had one set. Yes. I think that didn't help really because, certainly the budget was very small, and there seemed to be such a lot of things to do.
And that, of course, would have been Colin Baker's first story. Was there sort of a sense of that you've got to get extra pressure for that story, that it's got to be right?
Well, I didn't feel it at the time. Colin Baker came in and the sort of metamorphosis happened in, the wardrobe where he's finding a costume and that sort of thing, which I thought seemed in a way a bit tame. I don't know. But then seeing it on screen, it was really rather different in the final, when it was all put together. I think also because we didn't, we rehearsed recording, we didn't do things in strict order either. So I don't think, to be honest, Alex, I can't really remember very much about it, but I don't think we did that at the beginning either. So, maybe you didn't get the sort of, the import of it really that you would have done if we'd have done it, in strict story order.
Because, of course, Doctor Who then was, something like Twin Dilemma is a number of parts across 3 or 4 weeks, for example. But something like Yes, Prime Minister, where you're across 2 series of it, that must be a far more sort of perhaps rewarding process, that you can develop a design and continually sort of tweak it and evolve it as you go along.
Yes, possibly. I think also the parameters on that were rather different, really. You knew that you'd got to, do number 10. And I went to number 10 a couple of times to have a look around. So you knew, obviously what you're doing. There were some things that they asked that we didn't specifically show for security reasons, which is quite understandable, obviously. And it was a very interesting thing. The sets were huge, and we had 2 studios. We'd go from Studio 3 to Studio 4 because we couldn't possibly get everything together as we had an audience for that show. So we'd have the audience in, I think it was Studio 3 with the audience, and then Studio 4. That was complete sets, whereas it was half and half in Studio 3.
So when you've got an audience, how does that influence how you design a set? Because of course, I suppose naturally you want to design it with 4 walls.
Yes, well, with that, obviously, the audience have got to see it. So it is, you're going really sort of in the region of theatre, the way that you're designing it. Occasionally we did have a 4th wall, that we would truck in for reverse shots and things like that. But mainly the audience has got to see what's going on, especially because of the laughter, really. And there's a lot to listen to in the Yes, Prime Minister as well. But some of the sets were, in fact, the lengthier speeches that Nigel Hawthorne had. He liked to do those where there wasn't an audience so that he could concentrate. They really were quite wordy, and obviously it was a lot to do.
Yes, I think certainly, very well crafted scripts, and a lot of it's
Oh
still very
yes,
relevant today.
brilliant. Yes, absolutely wonderful. Yes, and so true, a lot of them as well. Is it right to say that?
Yes, I think very true today. But something like that, of course, you'd had Yes Minister beforehand.
Yeah.
Would you have sort of looked back at sort of the tone and the image of it beforehand, or just treated this as a totally new series?
Oh, well, it was treated, yes, as a totally new series because obviously Jim Hacker has, gone up in the world. But I mean, I was always a great fan of Yes Minister anyway. So, one was aware of, what was going on, really.
And were shows like that particularly interesting to work on? To have a combination of studio audiences, but both very sort of clever wording and jokes. Was that quite an interesting atmosphere to be part of?
Oh, definitely, yes, yes.
Because I
Very.
imagine something like May to December must have had a similar feel.
Yes, yes. I mean, but that's very much sort of in a lighter vein, I think. Yes, that was very nice to do. I mean, we had little bits of filming on that, but it was mainly studio. And we did that at the old Elstree studios.
Of course, yeah.
That was, yes, the BBC used that, which was rather nice. Because with that, whereas with Yes Prime Minister, for example, was done in Television Centre, the minute that was finished on the night, those sets came out and they were, back again the next week, sort of thing. But with May to December, with the stock set, we could keep them standing because nothing else was in that studio at all. So that was very good. You didn't have the sort of usual, job of trying to make sure the joins didn't show and all that because it was a standing set.
And I was interested, amongst the jobs you've done, one show that you kept coming back to was Comedy Playhouse over sort of a 6-year tenure. Was it quite nice to be dipping back into that and doing what were one-off stories, rather than thinking about a sort of longevity for design?
Yes, they were very enjoyable to do. Yes, I like those very much. Yeah.
And who were the sort of people you would have learnt from as you went through it? Are there particular designers that stand out?
Well, yes, I mean, whether you would have heard of Fanny Taylor, who did a lot of big dramas. The thing is, at Television Centre, in the lunch hour, there was always this tradition. You went around all the studios to see what everybody else was doing. She did some very big dramas and beautiful sets. Eileen Diss, who was a freelance designer, did a lot of very notable things as well. Spencer Chapman, have you come across him? Yes. Well, Barry Newbury did some very nice things as well. But that was the thing. That's how you sort of, saw what people were doing and got your ideas and thought, oh, yes, that's, great. So you learn from that, really.
And I suppose it was an atmosphere that, whilst you wouldn't perhaps directly go up to someone for advice and a design, but you could bounce ideas off like-minded people. Whereas, of course, today a designer is the only person. There's only one designer around.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, it was quite a shock actually when I went freelance, and you suddenly find just completely on your own. You can't just pop, along and chat to somebody and say, "Oh, have you used so and so? What do you think about it?" It's just right, okay, yes.
I was just say, going freelance, was it perhaps just the way that you worked changed rather than actually what you were doing?
I think both, really. I mean, mainly when I was freelance, I worked in comedy series. We did one or two other sort of little one-off things. but there wasn't the range that I had at the BBC, I suppose.
And was that just because you felt comedy perhaps suited your way of working, or was it just how things happened?
That's just how things happened, really. Yes.
Because one of the other very well-known series you worked on was Crackerjack, which we can't not mention.
And I never had a pencil after all that. Gosh, you're certainly going back in time.
But
Yes,
something like that must have been at a sort of an established set beforehand. So how much can you make it your own, or are you almost just sort of keeping an eye on it?
Well, but they used to do little dramas and things in that, though. From what yes, and games, those horrible games. It was done at the television theatre. Did you ever go there when it was a television theatre still in Shepherd's Bush?
No, sadly not. No.
Oh, on Shepherd's Bush Green, yes. Well, it was done there, and it was very limited, the space that you had. Yeah, no, but the thing was, it's extraordinary, really, because Michael Aspel was in it when I did it, and then he went on to do lots of other things, obviously.
Because I suppose from a design point of view, you get sort of sketch show format, game show format. That must have combined a bit of everything.
Yes, I suppose it was really. Yes, I can't believe you brought that up. Sorry. Good Lord. I think I was 6 when I did that.
Well, amongst all of the mixed and very varied shows you worked on, does one particularly stand out as perhaps the most challenging or most enjoyable?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think quite a few, really. I mean, I liked, obviously, Yes, Prime Minister. And I also did something else with Sydney called Gentlemen's Club. I enjoyed doing that. But there were other, actually we did that as a freelance, that wasn't BBC. But there were sort of quite small things that I really liked. One of the things I did, was No Time to Say Goodbye. And that was about the Kinder movement, and children being brought out of Germany. And it was a sort of a film, but we did, little setups. I found that very interesting. And some of the music programs I liked as well. One in particular, I did a masterclass with Julian Bream, and it was at his house, as he lived out in the country, and he had a barn alongside the house, which was a studio. And students were going there to do this masterclass, and we were taking some scenery, just sort of rosters and seating. And we got there, and I went to the house, and I thought, well, I better, introduce us. We're the BBC. Anyway, I went into the garden, and I saw this sort of man in old corduroys and things up a ladder, cleaning the guttering from the roof. And I said, could you tell me where I might find, Mr. Julian Bream? We've come from the BBC. And he said, oh, yes, I'm Julian Bream. And I thought, my God, those hands cleaning out the guttering, really. And that was a nice programme to do anyway, because, he's such a wonderful guitarist. It was absolutely magical just watching him with the students and talking. It was marvellous, yeah. So lots of different things, really. The Lenny Henry shows I liked, because we did some dramas. We did quite a bit of filming in Birmingham. That was good. Three of a Kind, which was a show, I don't know whether, I think these are all a bit before your time, really. I did something interesting with Jackie Mason. Do you know Jackie Mason, the comedian? He was a rabbi at one time. And it was a sort of pilot in a way for a chat show. And that was it was nice meeting him. And it was good, but I didn't sort of, they only did the one, which was rather a shame, I thought. But,
well, I think it's clear, you know, you've done all sorts of different genres and scales of productions. But so, I know we have touched upon just some of those, and perhaps some you weren't expected to talk about. But I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, Valerie. It's been an absolute joy to scratch the surface of some of your work. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure. Thank you.